Samuel Dale Sam Brownback is an American politician currently serving as Governor of Kansas. A member of the Republican Party, Brownback was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives during the Republican Revolution of 1994, representing Kansas's 2nd congressional district for a single term, before running in a 1996 special election for the Senate seat previously held by Bob Dole.He won that election, and 2 regular elections following, serving until 2011. He ran for president in 2008, but withdrew before the primaries began and endorsed eventual Republican nominee John McCain. He was elected governor of Kansas in 2010 and took office in January 2011. Brownback supported the 2007 Iraq War troop surge and has also voiced his support for Israel. He opposes same-sex marriage and has described himself as pro-life. As governor, Brownback signed into law one of the largest income tax cuts in Kansas's history. Brownback turned down a $31.5 million grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to set up an insurance exchange as part of the federal health care reform law, signed a bill that blocked tax breaks for abortion providers, banned sex-selection abortions, and declared that life begins at fertilization. The income tax cut generated substantial budget deficit and led some former and current Republican officials to criticize his leadership in the run-up to the 2014 gubernatorial election by endorsing his opponent, Paul Davis. Brownback was re-elected in a close race with Davis. Early life. Sam Brownback was born on September 12, 1956, in Garnett, Kansas, the son of Nancy and Glenn Robert Brownback. He was raised in a farming family in Parker, Kansas. Some of his ancestors, of German descent, settled in Kansas after leaving Pennsylvania following the Civil War. Brownback was state president of the Kansas FFA Association, and was one of the national vice presidents of the National FFA organization from 1976 to 1977. While at Kansas State University, he was elected student body president and was a member of Alpha Gamma Rho. He received his J.D. from the University of Kansas in 1982. After college, Brownback spent about a year working as a broadcaster. He hosted a weekly half-hour show. Personal life. Brownback is married to Mary Brownback, whose family owned and operated Stouffer Communications until its sale in 1995. They have 5 children: Abby, Andy, Elizabeth, Mark, and Jenna. 2 of the children are adopted. Early career. Brownback was an attorney in Manhattan, Kansas, before becoming the Kansas Secretary of Agriculture in 1986. In 1990, he was accepted into the White House Fellow Program and detailed to the office of the U.S. Trade Representative from 1990 to 1991. Brownback then returned to Kansas to resume his position as Secretary of Agriculture and remained in that position until 1993. He was elected to the United States House of Representatives in 1994 and next ran in the 1996 special election to replace Senator Bob Dole, who had resigned his seat during his presidential campaign, beating appointed Republican Sheila Fram. U.S. Senator elections. Sheila Fram was appointed to fill the seat of U.S. Senator Bob Dole when Dole resigned in 1996 to campaign for president. Brownback defeated Fram in the 1996 Republican primary and went on to win the general election against Democrat Jill.He. In 1998, Brownback was elected to a full 6-year term, defeating Democrat Paul Feliciano. He won re-election in the 2004 Senate election with 69 69% of the vote, defeating his Democratic challenger, Lee Jones, a former Washington, D.C. lobbyist. Tenure. Brownback was a member of the Judiciary Committee, the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Joint Economic Committee, and the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, also known as the Helsinki Commission, which he at one time chaired. The Helsinki Commission monitors compliance with international agreements reached in cooperation with Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Brownback did not run for re-election in 2010, in accordance with his support of term limits for members of Congress. In 2000, Brownback and Congressman Chris Smith led the effort to enact the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. President Clinton signed the legislation in October 2000. According to Christianity Today, the stronger enforcement increased the number of U.S. federal trafficking cases eightfold in the 5 years after enactment. As of August 12, 2007, in the 110th session of Congress, Brownback had missed 123 votes due to campaigning, surpassed only by Tim Johnson of South Dakota, who due to a critical illness had missed 100% of the votes of the 110th session, and John McCain of Arizona with 149 votes missed due to campaigning. As of April 2012, Brownback had an approval rating of 34% according to a Survey USA poll. A Republican polling company found his approval rating to be 51% in May 2012. In November 2015, Brownback had an approval rating of 26% according to a Morning Consult poll, making him the least popular governor in the United States. C Street residents. On April 1, 2010, news sources reported that Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington had urged an ethics investigation into a possible violation of the Senate's gifts rule by Republican senators lodging in a townhome owned by C Street Center, Inc., in turn owned by Christian advocacy group The Fellowship. According to the report, Brownback, 3 additional senators, and 4 U.S. representatives were staying in the townhome. Crew alleged that the property, rented out for $950 a month per person, was being let well under the rate of similar lodging in the neighborhood, which regularly ran from $4,400 to $7,500. Brownback supporters argued that the rooms rented out at C Street were not the equivalent of individual apartments with private bathrooms, kitchens, and living rooms. The lawmakers share communal space. Senator Tom Coburn's spokesman John Hart told The Hill, "Anyone who has spent 10 minutes on Craigslist would realize that C Street residents pay fair market value." Hart said, "Residents at the boarding house have one bedroom. Most share a bathroom. All pay for their own meals and share personal space with the other residents and guests. They even share the remote. They fight over the favorite channel." Quote. In addition, Hart stated that there are several Craigslist ads that demonstrate that $950 is fair market value for a room on Capitol Hill. Committees: Committee on Appropriations, Subcommittee on Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies. Subcommittee on Defense, Subcommittee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and related agencies. Subcommittee on the Department of State, Foreign Operations, and related programs. Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, and related agencies. Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Subcommittee on Aviation Operations, Safety, and Security. Subcommittee on Communications, Technology, and the Internet. Subcommittee on Competitiveness, Innovation, Protection and Export Promotion, Subcommittee on Surface Transportation and Merchant Marine Infrastructure, Safety and Security, Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, Subcommittee on Energy, Subcommittee on National Parks, Subcommittee on Water and Power, Committee on Foreign Relations, Special Committee on Aging, Joint Economic Committee, Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. 2008 Presidential Campaign. On December 4, 2006, Brownback formed an exploratory committee, the first step toward candidacy, and announced his presidential bid the next day. His views placed him in the social conservative wing of the Republican Party, and he stressed his fiscal conservatism. "I am an economic, a fiscal, a social and a compassionate conservative," he said in December 2006. On January 20, 2007, in Topeka, he announced that he was running for president in 2008. On February 22, 2007, a poll conducted by Rasmussen Reports held that 3% of likely primary voters would support Brownback. On August 11, 2007, Brownback finished third in the Ames straw poll with 15.3% of all votes cast. Fundraising and visits to his website declined dramatically after this event, as many supporters had predicted Brownback would do much better, and speculation began that the candidate was considering withdrawing from the campaign. This sentiment increased after his lackluster performance in the GOP presidential debate of September 5, broadcast from New Hampshire by Fox News Channel. He dropped out of the race on October 18, 2007, citing a lack of funds. He formally announced his decision on October 19. He later endorsed John McCain for president. 2010 gubernatorial campaign. In 2008, Brownback acknowledged he was considering running for governor in 2010. In January 2009, Brownback officially filed the paperwork to run for governor. Polling agency Rasmussen Reports found that Brownback led his then likely Democratic opponent, Tom Holland, by 31 points in May 2010. On June 1, 2010, Brownback named Kansas State Senator Jeff Collier as his running mate. On November 2, 2010, Brownback won over Holland with 63.3% of the vote, replacing Governor Mark Parkinson, who was sworn in after former Governor Kathleen Sebelius resigned from her position and accepted the appointment to U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services in 2009. Governor of Kansas. As governor, Brownback's demeanor is informal. At the Kansas Capitol, he may be found in the rotunda drinking coffee or in the hallways conversing with legislators. Two major goals were to eliminate income taxes and to increase spending on education, goals that have potential for conflict. Legislative agenda. Brownback has proposed fundamental tax reform to encourage investment and generate wealth while creating new jobs. Consistent with those objectives, he also has proposed structural reforms to the state's largest budget items: school finance, Medicaid, and Kansas public employees' retirement system, which have unfunded liabilities of $8.3 billion. Brownback sought to follow a red state model, passing conservative social and economic policies. Abortion. Brownback signed 3 anti-abortion bills in 2011. In April 2011, he signed a bill banning abortion after 21 weeks, and a bill requiring that a doctor get a parent's notarized signature before providing an abortion to a patient younger than 17. In May 2011, Brownback approved a bill prohibiting insurance companies from offering abortion coverage as part of general health plans unless the procedure is necessary to save a woman's life. The law also prohibits any health insurance exchange in Kansas established under the Federal Affordable Care Act from offering coverage for abortions other than to save the woman's life. A Kansas budget passed with Brownback's approval in 2011 blocked Planned Parenthood of Kansas and Mid-Missouri from receiving family planning funds for the state. The funding amounted to about $330,000 a year. A judge has blocked the budget provision, or ordered Kansas to begin funding the organization again, and agreed with Planned Parenthood that it was being unfairly targeted. In response, the state filed an appeal seeking to overturn the judge's decision. Brownback has defended anti-abortion laws in Kansas, including the Planned Parenthood defunding. You can't know for sure what all comes out of it afterwards, but it was the will of the legislature and the people of the state of Kansas, Brownback said. In May 2012, Brownback signed the Health Care Rights of Conscience Act, which will allow pharmacists to refuse to provide drugs they believe might cause an abortion. In April 2013, Brownback signed a bill that blocked tax breaks for abortion providers, banned sex selection abortions, and declared that life begins at fertilization. The law notes that any rights suggested by the language are limited by U.S. Supreme Court decisions. On April 7, 2015, Brownback signed the Unborn Child Protection from Dismemberment Abortion Act, which bans the most common technique used for second trimester abortions. This made Kansas the first state to do so. Arts. Brownback tried to eliminate the Kansas Arts Commission by executive order. However, the Kansas state legislature defied Brownback by restoring $689,000 in appropriations. Brownback responded by vetoing government funding for the Kansas Arts Commission in May 2011, making Kansas the first state to defund its arts agency. The commission was created in 1966. The decision has been one of his most controversial during his tenure as governor, generating opposition from Kansas arts leaders and enthusiasts around the state. The National Endowment for the Arts informed Kansas that without a funded state arts agency, it would not receive a planned $700,000 federal grant. Education. In April 2014, Brownback signed a school finance bill that would drive millions of dollars to Kansas schools. The bill also raised controversy by eliminating mandatory due process hearings, which are held before experienced teachers could be fired by the district. The bill also allows school districts to hire unlicensed teachers for science and math classes, and it creates a tax break for corporations that donate to private school scholarship funds. The resulting cuts in funding caused districts to shut down the school year early. Health care. In August 2011, Brownback announced he was declining a $31.5 million grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to set up an insurance exchange as part of the federal health care reform law. In May 2011, Brownback had directed the state's insurance commissioner to slow the implementation timeline for the exchange development. Upon announcing the refusal of the budgeted grant money for the state, his office stated, "There is much uncertainty surrounding the ability of the federal government to meet its already budgeted future spending obligations. Every state should be preparing for fewer federal resources, not more. To deal with that reality, Kansas needs to maintain maximum flexibility. That requires freeing Kansas from the strings attached to the Early Innovator Grant." The move was unanimously supported by the delegates of the state party Central Committee at its August 2011 meeting. But the New York Times editorial criticized Brownback for turning down the grant which could have helped ease the state's own budget. Instead of letting Kansas design its own model program for an online computer exchange to help people choose among health insurance providers, Mr. Brownback's rebuff increases the likelihood that the state must design one at its own expense or see federal officials create an exchange, as required under the new law. Brownback also signed into law the Health Care Freedom Act based on model legislation published by the American Legislative Exchange Council. Prayer Rally. Brownback was the only other governor to attend Governor Rick Perry's prayer event in August 2011. About 22,000 people attended the rally, and Brownback and Perry were the only elected officials to speak. The decision resulted in some controversy and newspaper editorials demonstrating disappointment in his attendance of the rally. Taxes. In May 2012, Brownback signed into law one of the largest income tax cuts in Kansas's history. Brownback described the tax cuts as a live experiment, stating that taxes, you need to get your overall rates down, and you need to get your social manipulation out of it, in my estimation, to create growth. We'll see how it works. We'll have a real live experiment. The law eliminates income taxes for the owners of 191,000 businesses and cuts individuals' income tax rates. The income tax cuts would provide $231 million in tax relief in its first year, growing to $934 million after 6 years. A forecast from the legislature's research staff indicated that a budget shortfall will emerge by 2014 and will grow to nearly $2.5 billion by July 2018. The cuts were based on model legislation published by the American Legislative Exchange Council. In an op-ed dated May 2014 in the Wall Street Journal, titled "A Midwest Renaissance Rooted in the Reagan Formula," Brownback compared his tax cut policies with those of Ronald Reagan and announced a prosperous future for Kansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri by having elected the economic principles that Reagan laid out in 1964. The act has received criticism for shifting the tax burden from wealthy Kansans to low and moderate income workers, with the top income tax rate dropping by 25%. Under Brownback, Kansas also lowered the sales tax and eliminated a tax on small businesses. The tax cuts helped contribute to Moody's downgrading of the state's bond rating in 2014. They also contributed to the S&P ratings credit downgrade from AA+ to AA in August 2014 due to a budget that analysts described as structurally unbalanced. As of June 2014, the state has fallen far short of projected tax collections, receiving $369 million instead of the plan for $651 million. The tax cuts and the effect on the economy of Kansas received considerable criticism in the media, including Michael Hiltzik in the Los Angeles Times, the editorial board of The Washington Post, The New Republic, and the New York Times, who described Brownback's conservative experiment as a laboratory for policies that are too far to the right, and that as a result, more than 100 current and former Republican elected officials endorsed his opponent in the 2014 gubernatorial race. Paul Davis. Grover Norquist defended the tax cuts as a model for the nation. 2014 gubernatorial election. In October 2013, Kansas State Representative Paul Davis, the Democratic minority leader of the Kansas House of Representatives, announced he would challenge Brownback in the 2014 Kansas gubernatorial election. In July 2014, more than 100 Kansas Republican officials endorsed his Democratic opponent, Davis. These Kansas Republicans said the concern was related to deep cuts cuts in education and other government services, as well as the tax cuts that have left the state with a major deficit. Brownback was re-elected, defeating Davis by just under a 4% margin.